My name is Sarah Lee, 34 years old. I am a major, an Army trauma surgeon, and a single mother of 3-year-old twins. 2 months ago, a truck ran a red light at a San Antonio intersection and turned the side of my car into a heap of scrap metal. I lay on an ambulance stretcher, my abdominal cavity flooding with blood because of a ruptured spleen. With hands covered in fresh blood, I tremblingly dialed my parents' number. I needed them, just for a few hours, to come to the house and watch Lily and Lucas, so my comrades could take me into the operating room to fight for my life. Instead of panic, my cracked phone screen lit up with a message from my mother. "Sarah, you're always so troublesome. Tonight your father, Vanessa, and I have tickets for Taylor Swift. Figure it out yourself." Right after that was a soulless smiley face emoji from my sister. They left me to die for a concert. Right there on that stretcher, with the copper tang of blood hitting my nose, I did two things. First, I called an emergency nanny service at triple the price. Second, I made a decision to erase their entire lives. I logged into my bank account and cut off the automatic payroll deductions completely. The monthly mortgage payments, the health insurance, the luxury expenses, the entire $3,200 a month I had been breaking my back to carry for them for the past 8 years. Wiped clean. 2 weeks later, there was a firm knock at my front door. Before I tell you who was standing on my doorstep that day and what devastating sentence was revealed, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel if you've ever been bled dry by your own flesh and blood. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to where all this injustice began. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the screech of twisting steel at the intersection of Interstate 35. One moment, I was thinking about what to cook for the twins. The next, my Toyota was being crushed like a soda can by a semi-truck that decided a red light was merely a suggestion. The frame of the car groaned, folding inward, the jagged edge of the door pillar driving straight into my ribs, piercing deep toward my spleen. I've spent a decade in the Army seeing the worst wounds humanity can inflict on itself. But when it's your own blood soaking through your OCP uniform, the training struggles to keep the panic at bay. "Stay with me, Major. Keep your eyes on me." Marcus Smith's voice was a thunderclap through the fog of shock. He was a massive man, a fellow medic who had pulled me from the wreckage. Now, inside the swaying ambulance, his large gloved hands were pressed firmly against the gaping wound in my side, trying to stem the tide. I could feel the hot, rhythmic pulse of my life leaking through his fingers and dripping onto the cold, diamond plate floor of the rig. The smell was overwhelming, the sharp metallic tang of iron mixed with the acrid scent of burnt rubber and spilled coolant. "The twins!" I wheezed, the pain a white-hot poker in my gut. "Marcus, my phone. I need my mom." Marcus didn't argue. He reached into my blood-stained cargo pocket and pulled out my iPhone. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks, reflecting the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the ambulance ceiling. With a trembling thumb, smeared with a deep crimson that made the Face ID fail twice, I finally broke into the home screen. I dialed Helen Lee, my mother. The line rang. Once, twice. Then a cacophony of sound exploded through the speaker. It wasn't the sound of a worried household. It was the rhythmic booming bass of a pop anthem and the screams of 70,000 fans. "Hello? Sarah? What is it now?" Helen's voice was sharp, annoyed, shouted over the music. "Mom," I tried to say, but my voice was a ghost of its former self. "I've been in an accident, San Antonio. I'm in an ambulance. My spleen is ruptured. I need you to come to the house. The twins. Lily and Lucas are alone with the neighbor, but she has to leave. Please." There was a pause. Not a pause of concern, a pause of inconvenience. Then, my father's voice, Richard, barked in the background. I heard him snatch the phone away. "Sarah, for heaven's sake, we are at the Taylor Swift concert," Richard roared. "Do you have any idea how much these VIP Eras tour tickets cost? Thousands of dollars, Sarah. Thousands." "Dad, I'm bleeding out," I whispered, tears of pure, unadulterated betrayal stinging my eyes. "You're a trauma surgeon, for God's sake." Richard's voice was full of venom. You deal with blood every single day. You're tough. You're military. Stop being so dramatic and don't ruin this night for us. We've waited months for this. Figure it out yourself." The line went dead. The silence that followed was louder than the sirens outside. Marcus looked at me, his jaw set in a hard, pained line. He had heard it all. My phone buzzed in my hand, a notification from the family group chat. My sister, Vanessa, had posted. It was a photo of the three of them, decked out in expensive merchandise, grinning ear to ear. Underneath it, she had sent a single emoji, a bright yellow smiley face. A drop of my blood fell from my chin, landing directly on that yellow circle, smearing the digital grin into a streak of red. In that moment, the physical pain vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline vacuum of emotion. The gold child sister, the boomer parents who lived in a suburb of Austin on my dime, they had just signed their own eviction notices. They were parasites, and I was the host they were willing to let die as long as the music kept playing. "Marcus," I said, my voice now as steady as a scalpel, "give me your phone." With his phone, I spent $3,000, money I didn't really have, to secure an elite 24-hour military childcare service. My children would be safe. Then I turned back to my own cracked screen. I opened the Bank of America app. Face ID caught my blood-streaked features this time. I bypassed the primary accounts and went straight to the scheduled transfers section. There it was. Transfer to Richard Lee. Amount, $3,200. Frequency, monthly. For 8 years, I had paid for their mortgage, their country club fees, and Vanessa's fashion career debts. I had lived in a small, cramped apartment near the base while they enjoyed the Austin sun on my blood-earned salary. My finger hovered over the screen. My heart rate was slowing on the monitor, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I pressed delete. A confirmation box popped up. "Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transfer? This will end a history of 96 successful transactions. 8 years." I pressed confirm. The screen flickered, showing an error message for a split second before the schedule vanished into the digital void. Transaction history, 8 years, canceled. As the ambulance doors swung open at the hospital bay and the bright, sterile lights of the trauma center blinded me, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. My family thought they were watching a concert. They didn't realize that the stage lights had just gone out on the only person who had ever kept them from the dark. I wasn't Sarah the daughter anymore. I was Major Lee, and I was going to war. The transaction history 8 years error message on my phone screen wasn't just a glitch. It was a digital ghost of every sacrifice I had ever made for people who wouldn't even hold a door open for me if their hands were full of shopping bags. As the paramedics wheeled me into the trauma center, my mind drifted back to the very moment this parasitic contract was signed. It didn't happen in a lawyer's office. It happened in a grease-stained roadside Waffle House off the interstate 8 years ago. The air in that diner was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and cheap tobacco. I can still see my father, Richard, sitting across from me, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist, a watch I later found out he bought while claiming he couldn't pay the electric bill. He didn't look me in the eye. Instead, he slid a pink bank notice across the sticky Formica table, right through a puddle of spilled maple syrup. "We're losing the house, Sarah," he had said, his voice dripping with a rehearsed kind of tragedy. He lit a cigar, blowing a cloud of thick, acrid smoke into my face. "Your mother is a wreck. Vanessa's fashion school tuition is overdue. After everything we did to raise you, the soccer camps, the braces, the roof over your head, we thought you'd be the one to step up. But I guess we were wrong about your loyalty." That was the gaslighting that started it all. He made me feel like my success as a young officer was a debt I owed them, rather than a result of my own grueling work. I was 26, a new second lieutenant with a sense of duty that they exploited like a natural resource. A week later, I was in my barracks at Fort Sam Houston. It was midnight, and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional bip of the microwave as I heated up a cup of instant noodles for dinner. I sat on my cold, iron twin bed and logged into the military pay portal. With a hollow feeling in my chest, I set up a monthly allotment of $2,400 to be sent directly to Richard Lee's account. That was more than half my take-home pay at the time. I convinced myself I was being a good daughter. I told myself that family was supposed to carry each other. I didn't realize I was the only one doing the carrying. The patterns of neglect were everywhere, but I chose to be blind. Take my graduation day from military medical school. I had spent 4 years in a pressure cooker, surviving on caffeine and sheer will. I stood on the parade deck in the blistering Texas sun for 2 hours, my dress uniform, heavy and suffocating, waiting for my name to be called. When I finally scanned the crowd, I saw them. They were late. Vanessa arrived in 4-inch designer heels, looking annoyed as she fanned herself with a program. "It's too hot out here, Sarah," she complained the moment I walked up to them. "My hair is frizzing. Can we just go?" Richard didn't bring flowers. He didn't offer a hug. He just snapped a quick, blurry photo on his phone and checked his watch. "We have reservations at that steakhouse downtown," he said. "The one with the 5-star reviews. You're paying, right? Since you've got that big officer's salary now." I paid. I paid for the steak, the wine, and the appetizers Vanessa ordered and barely touched. I paid while they laughed and talked about Vanessa's upcoming trip to New York, never once asking me about my residency or my upcoming deployment. The depth of the betrayal hit me months later when a misplaced credit card statement arrived at my apartment. I opened it, thinking it was mine, only to see Richard's name and my money. There was a charge for $1,200 for a 5-star hotel room in Milan during Fashion Week. Vanessa was networking, and my father was using the mortgage money I sent him to fund her champagne lifestyle, while I was pulls 24-hour shifts in a trauma ward. Wearing boots, I had to resole myself because I couldn't afford a new pair. I remember smoothing out that bill on my lap, my hands shaking. I looked at my rucksack sitting by the door, ready for another night of saving lives while my own family was bleeding me dry. I felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with the hospital food. I wasn't their daughter, I was an insurance policy. I was a safety net for people who were too lazy to walk on the ground. If you have ever felt like you were just a walking ATM for people who were supposed to love you, support this story by hitting that like button and subscribing. It helps more than you know to bring these stories to light. Comment the word enough if you are finally choosing yourself over people who only want your resources. I tucked the Milan bill into the bottom of my rucksack and headed to my shift. I stayed silent for 8 years. I bought into the lie that my value was measured by how much I could provide. But as I lay in that ambulance, watching my own blood ruin my uniform, the question I had been bearing finally clawed its way to the surface. What am I actually buying? Is it love, or is it just the privilege of not being hated by them? The answer was waiting for me in the ICU, and it didn't look anything like the people I shared a last name with. It was the 7th month of the pregnancy, when the floor fell out from under me. I was alone in my kitchen at 2 a.m, the harsh Texas moonlight cutting through the blinds in thin, jagged strips. A sudden, sharp cramp doubled me over, and then I felt it. The warm, terrifying slickness of blood against the back of my knees. I gripped the edge of the white tile counter, my knuckles turning white, staring down at the crimson spots blooming on the linoleum. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. I was a trauma surgeon. I knew what a hemorrhage looked like. I knew my twins were in danger. I reached for my phone, my fingers slick and trembling. I called my mother, Helen. I didn't need money. I didn't need a lecture. I just needed someone to drive me to the emergency room so I wouldn't have to bleed out behind the wheel of my car while carrying 2 lives. The line rang 4 times. When she finally answered, her voice was thick with sleep and irritation. I told her through gritted teeth about the bleeding, the cramps, the fear. I begged her to fly out, to just be there for one night. "Sarah, really?" she sighed, and I heard the rustle of high thread count sheets. Sheets I had paid for with my last bonus. "I can't just drop everything and fly to San Antonio. Vanessa is going through a crisis. She and that boy broke up, and she's a complete wreck. I have to stay here for her emotional support. You're a doctor, honey. You're tough. You're military. Just call an Uber and take a Tylenol." Don't be so dramatic. The click of the line was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I sat on that cold floor, staring at my own blood, while my mother comforted my sister over a broken heart. I went to the hospital alone. I survived alone. Fast forward 5 months. The twins were 3 months old, and I was back on the floor at the hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts because the army doesn't pause for motherhood. At 3 in the morning, while the rest of the world was dreaming, I wasn't in a nursery. I was huddled in a windowless utility closet between the mop buckets and the industrial-strength floor wax. The rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of the plastic breast pump was the only thing I could hear. Whir thump. Whir thump. I sat on a blue plastic bucket, the cold hospital air conditioning raising goosebumps on my arms. My skin smelled like a mix of sour breast milk and harsh disinfectant, the permanent scent of a military mother who had no village to lean on. I was exhausted down to the marrow of my bones, my eyes burning from 48 hours of near-constant wakefulness. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my lap. A notification from the Bank of America app. Automatic transfer. Successful. $2,400 to Richard Lee. I stared at the screen. That was nearly my entire paycheck for the pay period. While I was sitting on a bucket in a broom closet, bleeding milk for my children so I could keep working to feed my parents, my father was probably sleeping in the house I paid for. I looked at the yellowish fluid filling the plastic bottle, and then at the bank balance. I was a high-functioning ATM in a flight suit, and the people I was funding couldn't even bother to ask if I'd eaten today. The rain in South Texas doesn't just fall, it attacks. A week later, I was in the Walmart parking lot, the sky a bruised purple. I was trying to navigate a massive double stroller through the deluge, my arms laden with bags of the cheapest diapers I could find because I was budgeting for my family's luxury. The twins were screaming, their cries raw and jagged. My umbrella had snapped in the wind, leaving me drenched, my hair plastered to my forehead. I was trying to load the groceries into the trunk with one hand while keeping the stroller from rolling away with the other. My back ached with a dull, throbbing intensity that made every movement a battle. My phone pinged. A notification from Instagram. Vanessa had posted a photo. It was a high-resolution shot of a porterhouse steak at a 5-star restaurant in Manhattan. The table was glowing with candlelight. My parents were in the frame, grinning, holding up glasses of expensive Napa Cabernet. The caption read, "Family is everything. So blessed to have parents who support my dreams. #family. First #blessed #New York life." I stood there in the pouring rain, my boots soaking through, looking at the parents I was supporting and the sister who was eating a $100 meal on my dime, while I couldn't afford the name-brand diapers for my own kids. I didn't cry. I didn't have the energy for tears. I just felt a cold, hard stone settling in the pit of my stomach. The realization that family was just a word they used to describe their favorite source of income. 4 o'clock in the morning. I finally pulled my battered SUV into the apartment complex parking lot. I had just come off a double shift in the trauma unit, and my hands were still shaking from the adrenaline and the pure, bone-deep exhaustion. I put the car in park, but didn't move. I couldn't. I sat there in the silence, the engine ticking as it cooled. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, the worn, cracked leather cold against my skin. The darkness outside was thick, suffocating. I looked at my hands in the dim light of the dashboard. They were calloused, scarred from scalpels and years of hard labor. These hands were the only things keeping the Lee family afloat. These hands were the only things my children could depend on. I realized then that if I died right there, in this parking lot, my parents wouldn't cry for me. They would cry for the lost revenue. They would mourn the bank account, not the daughter. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles hurt. The twins were inside, sleeping, and I was out here, a ghost in my own life. I was the provider, the protector, and the ultimate victim of a blood-soaked contract I never chose to sign. I didn't need their love anymore. I needed to survive. And as I finally forced myself to open the car door, I knew the version of Sarah Lee that they could manipulate was officially dead. Consciousness returned to me in slow, agonizing waves, anchored only by the rhythmic, high-pitched beeping of the heart monitor that seemed to mock the sluggish pace of my own pulse. It had been 5 days since the twisted metal of my Toyota had tried to swallow me whole at that intersection. My throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper, and every breath was a calculated battle against the fire stitched into my abdominal wall. Through the thin, semi-transparent hospital curtain, I saw a tall, dark silhouette standing near the door. For one fleeting, delusional second, my heart leaped with a hope I hadn't yet managed to kill. "Mom," I thought, my mind hazy from the heavy fog of pain medication. She came. She finally chose me over the concert. But as the figure stepped forward and pulled the curtain back, the silhouette didn't resolve into my mother's designer silk or the scent of expensive perfume. Instead, the figure was draped in mud-stained OCPs, the olive drab and tan camouflage of the United States Army. It was Marcus Smith. He looked like he hadn't slept since the sirens started, his red-rimmed eyes fixed on me with a fierce, quiet intensity. He was still wearing his surgical scrubs underneath his uniform jacket, the fabric bearing the faded, rusty stains of dried blood from the night he had pulled me out of the wreckage. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached out and placed a large steaming cup of black coffee, no sugar, exactly the way he knew I took it, and a warm plastic container on the rolling aluminum bedside table. The scent hit me instantly, cutting through the sterile chemical tang of the ICU. It wasn't the bland, unidentifiable mush of the hospital's industrial kitchen. It was real chicken soup, slow-simmered with onions and carrots. Marcus had gone home during his only 4-hour break, cooked a meal from scratch, and brought it back to my bedside. The irony was a jagged blade in my chest. My own parents wouldn't drive 30 miles to save my life, but this man had spent his precious rest period making sure I could eat. "The twins," I rasped, my voice breaking as I tried to claw the oxygen mask away from my face. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled his phone from his cargo pocket and swiped to a photo. "They're safe, Sarah," he said, his voice a deep rumble that felt more grounding than any drug the doctors had given me. I looked at the screen. There they were, Lily and Lucas, sitting at a long metal table in the base's mess hall, surrounded by 4 nurses and 2 burly sergeants from our unit. They were elbow-deep in plastic bowls of mac and cheese, their faces smeared with orange glow and genuine smiles. "We've got a 24-hour escort rotation on them," Marcus whispered, leaning over to gently pull the heavy hospital blanket back up to my chest. "Jenkins, Martinez, the whole crew. They've turned the pediatric ward into a fortress. No one gets near those kids without a military ID, and a very good reason." Over the next 3 days, the silence from Austin became a physical weight in the room. No calls, no voicemails, not even a generic get-well text from Richard or Vanessa. I was their daughter, their sister, their primary source of income for 8 years, yet I had been discarded like a broken appliance the moment I stopped providing. But that cold, hard plastic folding chair next to my bed? It was never empty. Captain Martinez showed up on Tuesday with a giant pack of name-brand diapers she'd bought at the PX with her own money. Sergeant Jenkins arrived on Wednesday with a duffel bag stuffed with my clean clothes and the twins' favorite stuffed animals, having used the spare key I'd given him for emergencies. These people didn't share my DNA. They weren't on the family tree that Richard Lee so proudly bragged about at his country club. But they were building a wall of loyalty around me, while my biological kin were busy calculating how to keep their Lexus in the driveway without my $3,200 monthly check. I was witnessing the ultimate American paradox. I had been forced to buy love from my parents for nearly a decade, but I was receiving the real thing for free from strangers who shared nothing but a uniform. By the 5th night, the physical restlessness surpassed the pain. I told Marcus I needed to walk. The incision across my abdomen felt like a seam of liquid fire every time I took a breath, but I leaned my entire weight into his massive forearm as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. We began a slow, agonizing shuffle down the sterile, white-lit hallway. The only sound the rhythmic beeping of the distant monitors and the heavy, reassuring thud of his combat boots on the linoleum. "Marcus," I whispered, gripping his arm so hard my knuckles turned white against his camouflage sleeve. Why are you doing this? You were supposed to be on leave. You were supposed to be in Galveston with your family. Marcus didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the end of the hallway, his jaw set in the hard, unyielding line of a soldier on watch. Because in the army, Sarah, we don't leave our own behind, he said, his voice echoing softly in the empty corridor. Your family, not the kind that shares a last name and a mortgage, but the kind that shares the dirt. That's the only kind that matters when the lights go out. For the first time since the truck hit me at that intersection, the dam finally broke. I didn't sob for the mother who ignored my bleeding or the father who valued a concert ticket over my life. I cried for the overwhelming, unearned kindness of the found family standing right beside me. As I leaned my head against Marcus's shoulder, the oxygen I was breathing finally felt like it belonged to me. I was safe. For a few hours, the world was quiet, and the debt I had carried for 8 years felt like it had finally been paid in full by people who asked for nothing in return. But as Marcus helped me back toward my room, the peace was shattered by a sharp, aggressive rapping on the ICU's glass door. The parasites had realized the host was no longer feeding them, and they had come to the hospital not to offer comfort, but to demand their supply. Peace is a fragile thing in the military quarters of San Antonio, especially when you are recovering from a surgery that nearly claimed your life. 2 weeks had passed since the twisted metal of my Toyota was cut away from my body. I was back in my small home, the air thin with the scent of medical-grade disinfectant and the soft, rhythmic breathing of my twins. I was still moving with the stiff, ginger caution of someone held together by heavy-duty stitches and sheer willpower. Then, the silence of the afternoon was shattered. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was a rhythmic, aggressive pounding that vibrated through the cheap wood of my front door. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who was on the other side. Only 3 people in this world had the audacity to knock like they owned the property I paid for. I pulled the door open, my hand instinctively pressing against the thick bandage under my t-shirt as the tension pulled at my incision. Standing there was the Lee family trinity: Richard, Helen, and Vanessa. They didn't come bearing groceries. There were no bags of fruit, no hot meals, no get-well-soon balloons. Vanessa pushed past me first, her sharp stiletto heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards with a sound like a countdown. She was draped in a shimmering silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Her designer Gucci bag clutched tightly in her manicured hand. The air in my living room was instantly colonized by the suffocating, cloying scent of Chanel No. 5, Vanessa's signature war paint. Helen followed her, throwing a fake Hermes bag onto my sofa with a huff of theatrical exhaustion. Richard didn't even look at me. His eyes swept over my modest quarters with a look of undisguised disdain before he finally landed his gaze on my face. "Do you have any idea how much you embarrassed us, Sarah?" Helen began, not asking about my ruptured spleen or the scar running across my abdomen. She sat on the edge of my chair as if she were afraid she might catch poverty from the fabric. "I was at the checkout at Whole Foods yesterday. Whole Foods, Sarah. I had a cart full of organic greens and imported cheese for the dinner party I was hosting for the tennis club." She paused, her voice rising to a shrill, indignant pitch. And the card was declined, in front of everyone. I had to stand there like a common beggar while the cashier told me the account was empty. I've never been so humiliated in my entire life. Richard stepped forward, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand down on my glass coffee table, the vibration making the twins' plastic toys rattle. "Why did you do it, Sarah? How dare you unilaterally cancel the automatic transfer without asking for my permission?" I stood there, my back straight, refusing to sit even though my legs felt like lead. "Your permission?" I whispered, my voice cold and dry. "It's my salary, Dad. Money I earn as a trauma surgeon while you're out on the golf course." "We raised you," Richard roared, his voice booming through the small apartment. "We gave you everything. That $3,200 a month isn't just your money. It's the dividend for our investment in you. We have a mortgage to pay, Sarah. We have a lifestyle to maintain." Vanessa, who had been busy scrolling through her phone, finally looked up. She sighed, a long, dramatic sound of artificial pity. She smoothed her perfectly curled hair and stepped toward me, her voice dropping into that fake, honeyed tone she used when she was about to twist the knife. "Mom, Dad, stop yelling," Vanessa said, looking at me with eyes as cold as a New York winter. "Can't you see? Sarah isn't herself. She's had a traumatic experience. That accident, the blood, it's clearly triggered something. It's PTSD, isn't it, Sarah? You're having a mental breakdown. Canceling the family support is just a symptom of your instability." She turned back to my parents, her smile sharpening into something predatory. "In fact, I think we have a moral obligation to report this to her commanding officer. A trauma surgeon who is mentally unfit to manage her own finances shouldn't be holding a scalpel, right? We're only doing this because we love you, Sarah. We need to make sure you get the help you need while we manage the accounts for you." The threat was clear. They weren't just here for the money anymore. They were threatening my career, my rank, and the only thing that allowed me to provide for my children. They were willing to brand me as insane to a commanding officer just to get their hands back into my pockets. I looked at them, really looked at them. For 8 years, I had seen them as my responsibility, my burden to carry. But in the cold light of my military quarters, the illusion shattered. They didn't look like parents or a sister. They looked like parasites, flesh-colored worms that had grown fat and bloated on my blood, now writhing in a frantic, ugly panic because the host had finally stopped feeding them. A sharp, stinging heat radiated from my surgical wound as I felt a drop of fresh blood soak into the gauze, triggered by the stress. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply took a slow, deep breath, feeling the discipline of a decade in uniform settle over my skin like armor. I took one step back and pointed a trembling, yet certain finger toward the front door. "Get out," I said, the words cutting through their noise like a surgical blade. The air in my living room was still thick with the cloying, suffocating scent of Vanessa's expensive perfume and the sharp, metallic tang of my own fear. Richard stood there, his face a deep, mottled purple, his chest heaving with the indignation of a man who believed he owned the air I breathed. He had just threatened to dismantle my career, to report me to my commanding officer as mentally unstable. All because I had dared to stop funding his country club lifestyle. Vanessa stood behind him, smirking, her eyes fixed on her phone as if she were already drafting the email that would end my life in the army. I didn't let them see me tremble. I didn't let them see the drop of blood soaking into my shirt. I channeled every ounce of discipline I'd learned at West Point and in the trauma bays of Fort Sam Houston. I stood tall, my spine as straight as a bayonet. "I am a major in the United States Army," I said, my voice cutting through their noise like a winter wind in West Texas. "I have operated on soldiers in the middle of sandstorms. I have held together broken bodies that were more metal than flesh. Do you really think I am afraid of a spoiled, designer-clad sister and a father who is too lazy to pay his own mortgage? Get out of my house. Now. Immediately. My money is not a blood bag for you to drain until I'm dead. If you ever set foot on this base or contact my command, I will have the military police escort you out in zip ties. Leave." Richard took a step back, his entitlement finally meeting a wall it couldn't climb. His eyes darted around the small apartment, his mouth twisting into a sneer of pure, concentrated venom. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Sarah," he spat, his finger shaking as he pointed at me. "You've just signed your own death warrant. I will make sure every aunt, uncle, and cousin in this family knows exactly what kind of ungrateful wretch you are. You'll be alone. You'll have nobody. Don't come crawling back when your kids are hungry." He turned on his heel, Vanessa following with a dramatic flip of her hair. The front door slammed with a violent, bone-shaking thud that rattled the framed photos on my wall. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was the silence of a battlefield after the artillery has stopped. I collapsed into a chair, my hands finally shaking. Richard's threat wasn't idle. In our family, the Joneses' facade was everything. To them, the truth was whatever Richard Lee said it was. 3 days later, the silence was broken by a different sound. I was sitting on my porch, watching the South Texas sun dip below the horizon, when a black town car, polished to a mirror shine, pulled slowly up to the curb of my military quarters. The passenger door opened, and a sound I hadn't heard in years echoed across the driveway. Thud, thud, thud. It was the rhythmic, authoritative strike of a solid oak cane against the pavement. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Out of the car stepped a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very limestone of the hill country. Thomas Lee, my grandfather. He was a former federal judge and a retired JAG officer, a man who had spent 40 years deciding the fates of men much more dangerous than my father. He wore a crisp, charcoal wool suit that smelled faintly of cedar and the familiar, sharp aroma of a Cohiba cigar. He didn't say a word as he reached the porch. He simply removed his felt fedora, stepped forward, and pulled me into a hug that felt like a fortress. "I heard the noise all the way in Austin, Sarah," he whispered into my hair. Following him was my Aunt Eleanor, the black sheep who had been cast out years ago for refusing to play Richard's games. She was already lighting a menthol cigarette, her eyes scanning the base housing with a look of practiced observation. She followed us inside and threw a thick manila envelope onto my glass coffee table. "Vanessa is a sloppy liar, Sarah," Eleanor said, a thin trail of smoke escaping her lips. "She's been posting on Instagram about family emergencies while trying to crowdsource sympathy from the cousins. She told everyone you've lost your mind and stolen their retirement fund. She didn't realize I've been tracking her credit card debt and her New York shopping sprees for months." Grandpa Thomas sat in my armchair, his heavy gold signet ring tapping rhythmically against the armrest. He looked at me, his eyes sharp and analytical, stripping away my uniform and seeing the wounded granddaughter beneath. "I've spent my life in courtrooms, Sarah," he said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. "I know the difference between a soldier and a parasite. Aunt Eleanor told me everything. I know what they've been doing to you. I know about the $3,200 a month. I know about the mortgage. And I know about the Taylor Swift concert." He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a heavy cream-colored card with gold-embossed edges. It was an invitation to his 70th birthday gala, the biggest event on the Lee family calendar. "Richard thinks he has won," Thomas said, his gaze turning to cold steel. "He thinks he has successfully isolated you. But he has forgotten who holds the gavel in this family. I want you to do something for me, Major. I want you to go back through 8 years of bank statements. I want a full financial dossier. Every mortgage payment, every luxury hotel, every dime they took from you while you were in surgery. This Saturday, the whole clan will be at my estate. And this Saturday, we aren't just cutting a cake. We are opening a trial. If you've ever reached the point where you had to stop being a victim and start being a warrior for your own truth, hit that like button and subscribe right now. This is for everyone who has had to stand their ground alone. Comment the word justice below to show your support for Sarah. Let's see how many of us have had to face our own family court-martial. I took the invitation, the weight of the gold-embossed paper solid in my hand. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't afraid. The countdown had begun. The air in my small military quarters was thick, not with the smell of hospital bleach anymore, but with the acrid, heavy scent of printer ink and the dry ozone of a machine working far beyond its limits. For 4 hours, my inkjet printer had been a rhythmic screech against the silence, churning out nearly a decade of digital betrayal into physical form. My Aunt Eleanor was crouched on the floor, her knees clicking as she moved, sorting through hundreds of pages of bank statements that documented the slow, methodical draining of my life's work. I sat at the small kitchen table, a neon red highlighter gripped so tightly in my hand that my knuckles were white. With clinical precision, the kind I used when marking a surgical incision, I traced every single recurring transfer. $2,400 here, $3,200 there. Allotments for a mortgage I didn't live in, country club dues I never used, and marketing fees for a sister who hadn't worked a day in her life. On the glowing screen of my laptop, the final number on the Excel spreadsheet sat there like a death sentence. $364,200. "That's a house in the suburbs, Sarah," Eleanor whispered, her voice gravelly and low. "That's a college education for both your kids, paid in full, with enough left over for a retirement you'll never have to worry about." Before I could answer, my phone on the table began to vibrate, skittering across the wood like an angry insect. The caller ID showed Aunt Mary. She was Richard's sister, a woman who had once sent me hand-knit blankets for the twins, but who now sounded like a stranger controlled by a puppeteer. I answered, and her voice immediately filled the room, trembling with a rehearsed, mournful kind of pity. "Sarah, honey, we are all so worried about you," Mary began, and I could practically feel the poison Richard and Vanessa had dripped into her ear. "Richard told us everything. He said the accident, it did something to your mind. He said you're suffering from severe PTSD and you're lashing out at the very people who love you most. To kick your own parents out of your house while you're in such a state? It's heartbreaking, Sarah. We think you need to check yourself into a psych ward, just for a little while, to get your head straight. Please, for the sake of the family, just apologize to your father and get the help you need." She was the first of the flying monkeys, the relatives Richard was using to build a wall of isolation around me. They weren't just taking my money anymore, they were trying to steal my sanity. Eleanor reached over and snatched the phone from my hand, tapping the end call button with a sharp, decisive click. She didn't say a word. She simply grabbed the massive stack of 96 months of bank statements and pounded them against the table to align the edges. She took a heavy-duty, rust-pitted steel binder clip and clamped it onto the top of the stack with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Let them talk their trash," Eleanor said, sliding the entire weight of the evidence into a thick, brown parchment envelope. "They've spent a week painting you as a lunatic. Let them build their little fantasy world. Because on Saturday, we aren't going to argue. We are just going to slap them with the truth." She pulled a long final drag from her menthol cigarette, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like a ghost. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, humid Texas heat. The Lee family estate was a sprawling piece of property on the outskirts of the city, and the long gravel driveway was already choked with over 40 luxury SUVs, most of them black, all of them expensive, and nearly all of them polished to a mirror shine. It was a display of suburban wealth that felt obscene when I thought about the numbers highlighted in red inside my bag. I stepped out of Marcus's car, wearing a navy blue dress with a high collar and long sleeves. It was a uniform of a different kind, chosen specifically to hide the bandages and the jagged surgical scar that still burned across my abdomen. I felt the weight of the brown envelope in my hand, a physical anchor against the wave of anxiety threatening to pull me under. "You ready, Major?" Marcus asked, his voice low and steady. He remained in the car, his presence a silent perimeter guard. "I've survived worse than a dinner party," I said, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I walked toward the massive oak front doors. As I pushed them open, the sound of a smooth, live jazz trio drifted through the foyer, accompanied by the clinking of crystal and the practiced laughter of 40 people who thought they knew exactly who I was. The moment I stepped into the light of the ballroom, the music didn't stop because the musicians quit. It stopped because the air left the room. 40 pairs of eyes, uncles, aunts, cousins, and family friends, turned toward me in a synchronized wave. I saw the pity in some, the whispered judgment in others, and the outright disgust in the eyes of my father, who was standing near the bar with a glass of bourbon in his hand. To them, I wasn't a decorated surgeon or a mother of two. I was the crazy daughter who had finally snapped. I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my gaze. I gripped the brown envelope tighter and began to walk straight toward the head of the table where my grandfather sat. The 0 hour had arrived. The chandelier light in the Lee Estate ballroom felt like a series of interrogator's lamps, cold and unyielding against my skin. The jazz trio in the corner was playing something smooth and mindless, the kind of music designed to drown out the sounds of people being bled dry. As I stepped onto the polished mahogany floor, the room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. I could feel the collective weight of 40 pairs of eyes, uncles, aunts, and cousins, all viewing me through the lens of the crazy daughter narrative Richard had carefully constructed. I didn't have to wait long for the first strike. Vanessa glided toward me, her silk dress rustling like a snake in dry grass. She held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand, her face twisted into a mask of fake, sugary concern. She raised her voice just enough for the surrounding aunts to hear. "Oh, look, everyone, our favorite psychiatric patient has finally decided to join us." Vanessa's laugh was a sharp, jagged edge. How are you feeling, Sarah? Are the voices in your head being quiet today? We were so worried when Dad said you'd had a complete psychotic break after your little accident. Maybe you should put that heavy brown bag down before you hurt yourself. I didn't blink. I simply stepped to the side, my boots clicking with a military precision that seemed to offend the very air of the ballroom. I walked straight past the bar, past the flying monkeys, who were already whispering behind their hands, and stopped at the head of the dining table, where my grandfather, Thomas Lee, sat like a king on a throne of dark oak. The room was beginning to buzz with a restless, judgmental energy. Richard stepped forward, adjusting his gold cufflinks, his face a mask of disappointment. Sarah, this is your grandfather's 70th birthday. This is not the place for your delusions. Go home before you humiliate us further. Suddenly, the sound of a solid oak cane slamming against the hardwood floor echoed like a gunshot. Boom. The room froze. Grandpa Thomas didn't look at me. He stared directly at Richard, his eyes two chips of cold, gray flint. Sit down, Richard, he commanded, his voice a gravelly rumble that had once silenced entire courtrooms. In fact, everyone sit. We are going to have a different kind of toast tonight. Richard's face went pale, a thin bead of sweat appearing at his temple. Thomas turned his gaze back to my father. Richard, I have a very simple question. You've been living in that 4-bedroom house for 8 years. You haven't had a steady job since the recession. Tell me, and tell this entire family right now. Who has been paying the mortgage on that house every single month? Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked at Helen, who was suddenly very interested in her salad. Well, we have a system, an arrangement. The arrangement ends tonight, Thomas said. He reached over and snatched the thick brown envelope from my hand. He didn't just open it, he slammed the 96 months of bank statements onto the center of the table, right next to the silver centerpieces. Let's talk numbers, Thomas announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. I've spent the last 48 hours with an auditor. $230,400. That is what this crazy daughter has paid for the roof over your head, Richard. $76,800. That is the cost of your health insurance and your country club dues that she covered while she was deployed in a war zone. He turned his gaze to Vanessa, who was trying to hide behind her glass. And you. $12,000 in career support for a fashion line that doesn't exist, totaling $364,200. Every cent of it stolen from the salary of a woman who was busy saving lives in a trauma unit. The silence was now absolute. The aunts who had been whispering, "Poor Sarah," were now staring at Richard with horror and disgust. The gold child and the patriarch were being stripped naked of their lies in the middle of their own stage. But that isn't the worst of it, Aunt Eleanor said, standing up from her seat. She walked around the table, dropping a copy of a printout in front of every relative. This is the text message my brother sent on the night Sarah was lying in a pool of her own blood at a San Antonio intersection, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with contempt. She read the words aloud, her voice ringing like a death sentence. Sarah, you're always so troublesome. Tonight your father, Vanessa, and I have tickets for Taylor Swift. Figure it out yourself. Followed by a smiley face. The room recoiled. It was a visceral reaction. A collective shudder of revolution went through the family. Vanessa stood up, her face distorted, her voice a shrill shriek. She's lying. She's trying to destroy us because she's jealous. I took one step forward, my military boots echoing. I looked Richard in the eye, the man who had lived off my blood for nearly a decade, and then at Vanessa, the sister who would have let me die for a concert. I wasn't jealous, Vanessa, I said, my voice as cold as a surgical blade. I was an idiot. I believed that family meant something more than a bank account. But as I lay on that stretcher, listening to your music through the phone while I struggled to breathe, I finally realized what you are. You aren't family. You are parasites. I leaned over the table, my face inches from Richard's. He smelled of sweat and expensive bourbon. You said I was a burden? Look at this room, Richard. They aren't looking at a crazy woman. They are looking at a thief. I stood up straight, adjusted my navy dress, and turned my back on them. The transfers are dead. The house is being foreclosed. And as far as I'm concerned, you are officially dead to me. You aren't worth the blood it would take to save you. I walked out of the ballroom, the sound of the silence following me. The court-martial was over. The verdict was guilty. The parasites were finally left to starve in the cold, hard light of truth. The silence that followed my declaration in the ballroom was not empty. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket that settled over the Lee family estate. For 8 years, Richard had maintained a facade of suburban perfection built on the foundation of my paychecks. In one single night, that foundation had been pulverized. I watched as a visible circle of space formed around my father, mother, and sister. It was a social quarantine. The aunts and uncles who had spent the last week whispering about my psychotic break now looked at Richard with a visceral, skin-crawling disgust. Aunt Mary, the woman who had called to tell me I was a burden, couldn't even bring herself to look at my mother. She turned her back with a sharp, decisive rustle of her dress, a silent signal that the family bank was officially closed. Richard, Helen, and Vanessa left the estate not in a flurry of righteous anger, but in a hollow, shamed silence that echoed louder than any argument. The aftershocks of that night were swift and merciless. Without the $3,200 I'd been pumping into their accounts every month, the house of cards didn't just lean. It imploded. 3 months after the gala, I drove past the Austin suburb one last time. The lawn I had spent thousands of dollars to keep lush and green was now yellowed and overgrown, choking under the heat of the Texas sun. But the most satisfying detail was the sign hammered into the dry dirt near the driveway. It was a bright, obnoxious orange and white board that read, "Foreclosure, property of Bank of America." The bank didn't care about Richard's golf club status or Helen's social standing. They only cared about the $38,400 a year that had suddenly vanished from their ledger. My parents, who once looked down on common laborers, were forced to pack their designer luggage into a beat-up U-Haul and move into a damp, cramped basement apartment owned by a distant cousin who barely tolerated them. Richard, a man who once spent his afternoons sipping expensive bourbon, was now standing on his feet for 8 hours a day, stocking shelves at a local supermarket. I heard through the grapevine that he would hide in the back room whenever he saw someone from the old neighborhood walk down the aisle. Helen was working as a part-time cashier, her manicured nails now chipped and stained from handling dirty coins and plastic grocery bags. The gold child and the patriarch had finally been forced to taste the reality of the working world they had spent a decade exploiting. Vanessa's fall was even more poetic. When the money dried up, her fashion career in Manhattan vanished like smoke. The friends who had attended her champagne brunches on my dime disappeared the moment she couldn't foot the bill for the next round of drinks. Her influencer lifestyle was revealed for what it always was, a hollow shell fueled by a military surgeon's blood money. By the time the 4th month rolled around, Vanessa had traded her silk dresses for a grease-stained apron. She was now working double shifts at a loud, cramped diner in Brooklyn, carrying heavy trays of eggs and bacon to blue-collar workers who didn't care about her brand. Her hands, which once only held luxury handbags, were now red and raw from industrial dish soap. She was living in a tiny studio apartment with 2 roommates, realizing that in the real world, a smiley face emoji doesn't pay the rent. One late afternoon in San Antonio, I was sitting on my back porch, the air finally cool as the sun began to set over the horizon. I was reading a book, the twins playing quietly in the grass with Marcus. My phone buzzed on the wooden table next to me. It was an unknown number with an Austin area code. I knew who it was before I even picked it up. I answered, but I didn't say a word. I just listened. Vanessa's voice came through the speaker, but it wasn't the arrogant, mocking tone from the ballroom. It was a frantic, high-pitched sob. She didn't lead with an apology for the Taylor Swift concert. She didn't ask how my surgical scar was healing or how Lily and Lucas were doing. "Sarah, please," she wailed, her voice cracking with a desperation that was entirely self-serving. "The debt collectors are at the door. They're going to take my furniture. Dad and Mom can't help me. They're barely making enough for food. I just need a small bridge loan." "Just $5,000, Sarah. It's nothing to you. You have that major's salary. After everything we've been through, you can't just let your own sister end up on the street. I looked at my hands, the hands that had performed surgery while they were at a concert. I felt a cold, crystalline peace settle over my heart. There was no anger left, only a profound, immovable indifference. "I'm not a bank, Vanessa," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "And I don't have any family in Austin anymore. Figure it out yourself." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't listen to her scream or plead. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear, navigated to the contact settings, and tapped the button that read, "Block this caller." The screen flickered for a second, then went dark. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I tossed the phone onto the empty chair beside me and stepped off the porch to join my children in the yard. The parasites were gone, and for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't just surviving. I was finally, completely free. 1 year has passed since I walked out of that ballroom and left the wreckage of the Lee family legacy behind me. It is a humid Saturday evening in the outskirts of San Antonio, and I am sitting on the porch of the modest ranch-style home I bought with my own savings, money that finally belongs to me and my children. The Texas sky is a bruised, brilliant orange, fading into a deep purple that feels like a healing bruise. I pull my phone from my pocket, but I'm not checking for desperate text messages from parasites anymore. Those numbers have been blocked for 12 months. I open my banking application and navigate to the investment tab. I watch the screen for a moment as the numbers refresh. Every month, on the first day of the month, a transfer of $3,200 is automatically pulled from my salary. For 8 years, that specific amount was a blood tax, a forced tribute used to buy designer handbags for Vanessa and country club memberships for Richard. Now, that same $3,200 flows silently and efficiently into 2 separate accounts: the 529 college savings plans for Lily and Lucas. I stare at the green text on the screen, feeling a surge of quiet, immovable pride. If I hadn't nearly died that night, if I hadn't seen the truth through the haze of my own blood, this money would still be vanishing into the black hole of my parents' vanity. By the time my twins are 18, they won't just have an education, they will have the freedom I had to fight for. The generational curse of the Lee family, the cycle of using children as high-interest loans, was officially decapitated the moment I hit the confirm button on these accounts. My children will never know what it feels like to have to buy their parents' love. They will never be a line item in someone else's budget. A gust of wind carries the heavy, mouth-watering scent of mesquite wood smoke from the backyard, pulling me out of my thoughts. I stand up, the stiffness in my core a faint reminder of the surgery, and walk toward the screen door. The sound of the backyard is a symphony of real life. I hear the rhythmic sizzling of beef fat dripping onto glowing red coals, and the high-pitched, infectious laughter of my children as they chase a golden retriever through the tall grass. I step out onto the patio and breathe in the smell of charred brisket and cold beer. Aunt Eleanor is standing by the massive steel grill, a pair of tongs in one hand and a cigarette in the other. She flips a rack of ribs with practiced ease, letting out a loud, raspy laugh as she jokes with Marcus Smith. Marcus is wearing a faded army t-shirt, his sleeves rolled up as he hauls 2 heavy coolers filled with ice and glass bottles of beer from the kitchen. He catches my eye and gives me a sharp, respectful nod, the look of a man who knows exactly what kind of war I had to win to stand on this patio. Grandpa Thomas is seated in a heavy wooden Adirondack chair in the shade of a sprawling oak tree. He has a glass of neat bourbon in his hand, the ice long since melted, and he's watching the twins with a look of peaceful satisfaction. He's the only one left of my biological bloodline in this yard, but as I look around, I realize I've never been less alone. There isn't a single person here who expects a check from me. There isn't a single person here who would trade my life for a concert ticket. This is my found family, a brotherhood and sisterhood forged in the dirt and the trauma bays, anchored by a judge who finally chose justice over a failed son. I realize I need to wash the dust from my hands before we eat, so I head back inside to the master bathroom. The house is quiet, the air conditioning humming a steady, cooling tune. I stand in front of the vanity mirror and slowly reach down, hooking my fingers under the hem of my cotton t-shirt. I lift the fabric, exposing my midriff to the harsh fluorescent light. There it is. A long, jagged, pinkish silver line that bisects my abdomen. The scar is a permanent map of the night I stopped being a victim. To Richard and Helen, this wound was nothing more than a nuisance that interrupted their social calendar. They saw my blood as an inconvenience to their luxury. But as I trace the raised tissue with my thumb, I don't feel anger. I feel a cold, crystalline sense of victory. This scar is the receipt for my soul. It is the physical boundary that separates the woman who was a slave to her family from the officer who rescued herself. I pull my shirt back down, smoothing the fabric over the mark, and stand with my shoulders squared and my chin level. My back is straight, not because of military discipline, but because I no longer carry the weight of 3 grown adults on it. I walk back out to the porch, the evening air filling my lungs with the scent of freedom and mesquite. My children run to me, their small hands sticky with summer heat, and I scoop them up, feeling the solid reality of their lives against mine. I look out at the horizon, my voice low but carrying the weight of a final judgment. Love is not a transactional contract, I whisper into the Texas wind, my words sharp enough to cut through the ghosts of the past. If the people who raised you consider your self-respect to be a form of betrayal, then they never deserved your loyalty in the first place. My name is Sarah Lee. I didn't desert my family. I simply conducted a search and rescue mission for my own life, and I left the enemies of my peace exactly where they belong, in the rearview mirror.